The Druids are one of history's most enigmatic and intriguing figures, yet much about them remains shrouded in mystery. For centuries, they have captured the imagination of both historians and dreamers alike, with their deep connection to nature, their secretive rituals, and their revered wisdom. They were not just religious figures, but a class of scholars, healers, and political advisors within ancient Celtic society. To this day, the Druids hold a place in the collective imagination as guardians of ancient knowledge and mystical powers. And yet, despite the allure of their stories, the truth about them remains largely unknown, obscured by the passage of time and the layers of mythology that have accumulated over the centuries. The Druids lived during a period of great cultural complexity. They were primarily associated with the Celts, a group of tribes that stretched across a large part of Europe, from the British Isles to the edges of Asia Minor. Their heyday occurred between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, a time when the Celts were thriving, but their decline coincided with the spread of the Roman Empire. This introduction to the Druids is more than just an overview. It is an invitation to step into a world where myth and history entwine, where the known and the unknown exist side by side. To understand the Druids, we must first try to envision the world they inhabited, a world where the sacred and the mundane were deeply intertwined. The Celts themselves had a profound relationship with nature. They revered the natural world not just as a backdrop to their lives, but as an active participant in their spiritual practices. The Druids, as the spiritual leaders of these people, were thought to have an almost supernatural connection to the forces of nature, from the stars in the sky to the trees and animals that populated the land. It's important to note that the term Druid itself is one that we may never fully understand in its original context. What we know about the Druids comes largely from external sources, particularly from the writings of Roman historians and Greek philosophers, who had their own cultural lens through which to view them. The word Druid is believed to be derived from the Celtic root word druid, meaning oak knower, referencing their deep connection to the sacred oak tree, which was central to their religious practices. To the Romans, however, the Druids were often seen as a mysterious and sometimes threatening group. They were the custodians of knowledge and tradition, and their refusal to adapt to Roman influence led to their eventual decline. The ancient Roman author Julius Caesar, in his work Commentarii de Bello Gallico, famously wrote about the Druids in the context of his conquest of Gaul. His descriptions paint a picture of a class of learned individuals who were responsible for the religious rituals and legal matters of the Celtic tribes. According to Caesar, the Druids were not just priests but held the power to settle disputes, offer counts of kings, and perform sacred ceremonies. They were, in essence, the spiritual and intellectual backbone of the societies, and as such, their power was considerable. However, Caesar's writings, as with much of ancient Roman documentation, were colored by his own agenda. His portrayal of the Druids as enemies to be subdued reflects the Roman perspective of the time, an empire that was bent on spreading its own values and eliminating what it viewed as threats to its rule. It is, therefore, difficult to know just how accurate his portrayal of the Druids really was. What Caesar described is undoubtedly a version of the truth, but it is one that is filtered through the lens of conquest and imperialism. The difficulty in reconstructing the history of the Druids is compounded by the fact that they left behind no written records of their own. The Druids were an entirely oral tradition, passing down their knowledge and rituals through memorization and verbal transmission. This meant that much of what they knew was lost when their way of life was destroyed by the Romans and later by the spread of Christianity. The few surviving references to Druidic practices come from external accounts, most of which were written long after the Druids had ceased to exist in their original form. This gap in the historical record has only fueled the mystery surrounding them. Despite this, the image of the Druids has endured over the centuries, largely because of the myths and legends that have been associated with them. The Druids have come to be seen not just as historical figures, but as symbols of wisdom, mystery, and connection to the natural world. Their practices have been woven into the fabric of Celtic mythology, where they are often portrayed as magical figures who can control the forces of nature, predict the future, and communicate with the gods. One of the most enduring aspects of Druidic mythology is their association with the changing seasons. The Celts, like many ancient cultures, had a deep reverence for the cycles of nature, and the Druids were thought to play a central role in interpreting these cycles. The turning of the seasons, from the dark days of winter to the rebirth of spring, was seen as a sacred process, one that required the guidance of the Druids. Their rituals were believed to ensure the harmony between the earthly realm and the divine, maintaining balance in the world. In addition to their spiritual duties, the Druids were also highly regarded for their knowledge of the natural world. They were said to possess an encyclopedic understanding of plants, herbs, and the healing properties of various substances. They were revered as healers, able to cure ailments and offer wisdom on everything from childbirth to death. The connection between the Druids and nature was not just symbolic, but practical, as they relied on their knowledge of the land to live in harmony with the environment. The Druids' role as mediators between the human and divine realms was central to their existence. They were thought to have the power to communicate with the gods and spirits of nature, acting as intermediaries between the mortal and immortal worlds. Their rituals, which often took place in sacred groves or by ancient stone circles, were meant to invoke the blessings of the divine and to maintain harmony between the spiritual and physical realms. As we begin to explore the history and legacy of the Druids, it is important to approach them with a sense of wonder and respect. While we may never know the full truth of who they were or what they practiced, their mystery is part of what makes them so captivating. The Druids were not just people from the past, but symbols of a way of life that valued knowledge, nature, and spirituality in a way that seems distant from our modern world. By delving into the history of the Druids, we embark on a journey not just through time, but through the mist of mythology and mystery. It is a journey that invites us to question what we know, to embrace the unknown, and to reconnect with the natural world in a way that feels both ancient and timeless. Whether or not we ever fully understand the Druids, their legacy continues to inspire us, reminding us of the wisdom that can be found in nature and the mysteries that lie beyond the veil of history. This is just the beginning of the story. In the sections that follow, we will take a deeper look at the Druids, their role in society, their sacred rituals, and the powerful legacy they left behind. As we continue, we will explore not only the history of the Druids, but also the myths and stories that have been passed down through the ages. We will attempt to peel back the layers of mystery and uncover the true essence of this fascinating group, all while allowing you to relax and drift deeper into the soothing world of ancient knowledge. The origins of the Druids are as elusive and enigmatic as the figures themselves. Throughout history, they have been seen as a mystical class of priests, sages, and healers, but where they came from and how they evolved remains shrouded in mystery. No definitive records exist from the Druids themselves, and much of what we know has been pieced together from accounts written by outsiders, mainly the Romans and Greek historians, who, while documenting the Druids, often viewed them through a lens of bias and misunderstanding. The truth about the beginnings of the Druids lies buried beneath centuries of speculation, half-truths, and myth. What we do know is that the Druids were closely associated with the Celts, an ancient group of tribes that inhabited vast regions of Europe, from the British Isles to what is now modern-day Turkey. Their cultural reach extended from the Atlantic coast of France and Spain to the eastern shores of the Black Sea. It is this widespread geographical influence that makes pinpointing the origins of the Druids even more complicated. Were the Druids a product of a single culture, or were they a natural development from the diverse spiritual practices of the Celts scattered across different regions? The first known mention of the Druids appears in the writings of Greek philosophers like Herodotus, and later in the accounts of Roman historians. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, refers to a class of learned men among the Scythians who had similar characteristics to the Druids, though they were not called by that name. This early reference suggests that the Druidic tradition might not have been uniquely Celtic in origin, but rather part of a broader tradition of priesthood and scholarly roles found in Indo-European societies. This opens up the possibility that the Druids were influenced by earlier traditions from other ancient cultures, including the Persians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks, whose mystical practices also had strong connections to nature, astrology, and sacred knowledge. According to the Greeks and Romans, the Druids were highly educated individuals, with their knowledge passed down orally through an elaborate system of memorization and initiation. This oral tradition was likely one of the primary reasons why their practices and beliefs were so difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend. The Druids did not write down their sacred knowledge, as they believed that to do so would weaken its power. Instead, they relied on a strict system of oral transmission, where young initiates would spend years learning the ancient wisdom of the Druids through memorization, much like ancient bards and poets who recited long epic tales without writing them down. This method of preserving knowledge not only kept the wisdom of the Druids intact for generations, but it also made it impossible for outsiders to truly understand the depth of their teachings, adding to their mystery. The most prominent theory regarding the origins of the Druids ties them to the early Celtic societies of the British Isles. It is here, in the wind-swept hills and dense forests of ancient Britain, Ireland, and Gaul, that the Druids were believed to develop their distinct practices. The Celts, known for their warrior culture, lived in a world that was at once harsh and beautiful, their lives intricately tied to the natural environment around them. The Druids, as spiritual leaders of these societies, were the custodians of knowledge, wielding their power not through force but through wisdom, deep understanding of nature, and mystical rituals. One of the central elements of Druidic practice was their profound connection to nature. The Celts, like many ancient peoples, revered the natural world, seeing it not just as a physical space to inhabit, but as a living, breathing entity infused with spiritual significance. The Druids, as intermediaries between the human world and the spiritual realm, held the belief that the natural world was imbued with sacred energy. Trees, especially the oak, were considered especially sacred, and the Druids are often depicted in connection with groves of trees, performing rituals and ceremonies meant to commune with the divine forces of nature. The Druids' focus on nature also extended to their knowledge of plants and herbs, which they used for medicinal purposes, further reinforcing their role as both spiritual and practical healers. The idea of the Druids' role as spiritual leaders who acted as intermediaries between the human world and the gods aligns with the broader cultural practices of the Celts. The Celts were animistic in their worldview, believing that the spirits of nature inhabited the trees, rivers, animals, and even stones. The Druids, being the spiritual experts of their people, held a unique position in this belief system. They could interpret the will of the gods, mediate between different tribes, and offer guidance in both times of peace and times of war. This sacred duty was not to be taken lightly, and the Druidic path was reserved for those with a deep calling and a natural affinity for wisdom, balance, and understanding. The Druids' role within Celtic society was multifaceted, and their influence extended far beyond the realm of religion. They were also responsible for legal matters, serving as judges and arbitrators in disputes. The laws of the Celts were complex and based on a system of honor, and it was the Druids who were tasked with interpreting these laws and ensuring that justice was carried out. In this sense, the Druids functioned much like a combination of priest, judge, and philosopher, figures of immense authority who upheld the social order and kept the peace. They were also known to possess vast knowledge of the stars and the movements of the heavens, which allowed them to predict the changing of the seasons and the timing of important events, such as battles or harvests. The Druids were also deeply involved in the concept of sacrifice. The Celts, like many ancient cultures, believed in the power of offerings to the gods, and the Druids played a central role in these rituals. While the most sensationalized accounts of Druidic sacrifices often involve the imagery of human offerings, the true nature of these sacrifices remains a subject of debate among historians. Some suggest that the sacrifices were symbolic, representing the death and rebirth cycles of nature, while others believe that they were meant to ensure fertility, good harvest, and victory in battle. Whatever the exact nature of these rites, it is clear that they were intended to honor the gods and maintain the balance between the human and spiritual worlds. Despite the lack of written records, the Druidic tradition spread across Celtic territories, with some scholars suggesting that their influence even reached beyond the British Isles to parts of France, Spain, and even the Iberian Peninsula. The idea of the Druids as powerful, wise, and deeply connected to the natural world resonated across Celtic tribes, and they became an integral part of the cultural fabric of the ancient Celts. Their sacred knowledge, passed down through generations, remained a closely guarded secret, allowing them to maintain their mystique and authority for centuries. However, the arrival of the Romans in Celtic territories in the 1st century BCE marked the beginning of the end for the Druids. The Roman Empire, with its expansive conquests, sought to impose its own values and beliefs on the peoples it conquered, and the Druids, as a symbol of Celtic resistance to Roman culture, became a target. Julius Caesar, in his conquest of Gaul, famously wrote about the Druids, portraying them as a threat to Roman rule and describing how they were systematically hunted down and eliminated. The Romans saw the Druids as a dangerous force, and their influence waned rapidly as the empire expanded. In the centuries that followed, the Druids' power and influence diminished, and much of their sacred knowledge was lost. The rise of Christianity further suppressed the ancient Druidic traditions, as the new faith viewed the old practices as pagan and heretical. The Druids were driven underground, and their rituals and beliefs were forgotten, buried in the pages of history. Yet, despite the suppression, the Druidic legacy never fully disappeared. Their influence can still be felt today in the myths, legends, and spiritual practices that continue to captivate us. The origins of the Druids remain a fascinating puzzle, one that continues to intrigue historians and spiritual seekers alike. While we may never fully uncover the truth about where the Druids came from or how their practices evolved, their legacy endures as a testament to the power of knowledge, nature, and mystery. As we continue to explore their history, we will discover not only the story of their rise and fall, but also the timeless wisdom that they left behind. The role of the Druids within Celtic society was deeply intertwined with the cultural and spiritual fabric of the people they served. To understand the significance of the Druids, it is essential to first explore the broader context of Celtic society, one that was rich in tradition, bound by honor, and deeply connected to the natural world. The Celts were a diverse group of tribes who inhabited much of Europe, stretching from the British Isles to what is now modern-day Turkey. Though they were divided into various tribes, they shared common values, beliefs, and customs, including a reverence for nature and a complex system of social structures. In this society, the Druids were more than just religious figures. They were the keepers of knowledge, the teachers, and the mediators of law and justice. Celtic society was organized into three primary classes: the nobles or warriors, the common folk or farmers, and the clergy or priests. Among the clergy, the Druids stood at the top of the hierarchy, revered for their wisdom, spiritual guidance, and societal influence. They were not only priests who performed rituals and ceremonies, but also philosophers, historians, judges, and healers. The Druids occupied a position of immense power and respect within their communities, a power that was derived from their ability to connect with the divine, interpret the laws of the land, and offer counsel to kings and chieftains. The Druids' role in Celtic society was multifaceted, and they were central to the governance and cultural practices of the Celts. Their primary responsibility was to serve as the spiritual leaders of their people. They were the intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine, performing rituals, offering sacrifices, and conducting ceremonies that were believed to maintain harmony between the human realm and the forces of nature. These rituals, often held in sacred groves or near ancient stones, were essential for ensuring good harvest, fertility, success in battle, and the well-being of the tribe as a whole. The Druid spiritual authority was not limited to religious ceremonies alone. They were also trusted with the legal matters of the tribes. The Celts had a complex and sophisticated legal system, and it was the Druids who acted as judges and arbitrators. They interpreted and upheld the laws of the land, ensuring that disputes were settled fairly and that justice was served. Celtic law was based on principles of honor, and the Druids were the enforcers of this code. They had the power to render judgment in cases of theft, land disputes, and even matters of life and death. This dual role as both spiritual and legal leaders made the Druids indispensable to the functioning of Celtic society. In addition to their spiritual and legal duties, the Druids were also scholars and educators. They were responsible for preserving the history and traditions of their people, passing down knowledge through an elaborate system of oral transmission. The Druids did not write down their sacred teachings, as they believed that the power of knowledge lay in its oral transmission. Young initiates would undergo rigorous training, learning the sacred laws, the genealogies of the tribes, the stories of the gods and heroes, and the complex rituals that were central to Druidic practice. This education was not limited to spiritual matters. It also included astronomy, herbalism, and a deep understanding of the natural world. The Druids were believed to have an almost encyclopedic knowledge of plants, herbs, and the healing properties of various substances, which they used to treat ailments and cure illnesses. This holistic understanding of nature was an essential part of their role within society, as they were not only spiritual leaders, but also healers and caretakers of the land. The Druids' connection to nature was central to their worldview. The Celts saw the natural world as sacred and alive with spiritual energy, and the Druids were the ones who interpreted these forces. The Druids were often associated with groves of trees, particularly the sacred oak, which was considered the most powerful of all trees. The oak symbolized strength, endurance, and wisdom, and it was in the groves of oaks that many Druidic rituals were held. The Druids also held deep reverence for other aspects of nature, such as rivers, lakes, and springs, which were believed to be inhabited by spirits. Their connection to nature was not just symbolic, but practical. They relied on the land for sustenance, and their deep knowledge of the natural world allowed them to live in harmony with it. The social structure of the Celts was one in which honor and respect played a central role, and the Druids were highly respected members of society. Their influence extended beyond the spiritual and legal realms into the political sphere. Kings and chieftains would often seek the counsel of the Druids before making important decisions, whether related to warfare, diplomacy, or internal matters of governance. The Druids were seen as wise, impartial advisors who could offer guidance based on their deep understanding of the divine and the natural world. Their word was considered law, and their ability to interpret the will of the gods was seen as an essential part of maintaining order within the tribe. The relationship between the Druids and the rulers of Celtic tribes was symbiotic. While the Druids offered their wisdom and spiritual guidance, the ruler provided the Druids with protection and patronage. This mutual respect allowed the Druids to maintain their position of power and influence within Celtic society, even during times of war and conflict. However, the Druids were not just subservient to the rulers. They held an authority of their own, and their influence was sometimes enough to sway the decisions of kings and leaders. The political power of the Druids was rooted in their ability to maintain balance and harmony, not only within the tribe, but also in their relationships with the surrounding tribes. One of the most fascinating aspects of Druidic society was their use of ritual and ceremony to maintain the natural balance of the world. The Druids believed that the changing of the seasons and the cycles of the moon were crucial to the well-being of their people. They celebrated key moments in the agricultural calendar, such as the solstices and equinoxes, with elaborate rituals meant to honor the forces of nature and ensure prosperity. The most famous of these rituals was the celebration of the festival of Beltane, which marked the beginning of summer and the renewal of life. This fire festival, held on May 1st, was one of the most important events in the Druidic calendar and was believed to bring fertility, health, and good fortune to the land. Despite the importance of the Druids in Celtic society, their position was not without challenges. As Celtic tribes expanded and came into contact with other cultures, particularly the Romans, the Druids faced increasing pressure to adapt or be eradicated. The Romans, who sought to bring their own religious and political systems to the conquered peoples, viewed the Druids with suspicion and hostility. The Druids were seen as a threat to Roman authority, and the Roman historian Julius Caesar famously described them as part of a dangerous and rebellious force. As the Roman Empire expanded, the Druids were systematically hunted down, their sacred sites destroyed, and their influence diminished. The Romans sought to eliminate the Druids not only because of their spiritual power, but also because of the role they played in preserving the unique cultural identity of the Celts. Despite the Roman suppression of Druidic practices, the legacy of the Druids persisted. Even after their decline, the memory of their wisdom, their connection to nature, and their role as leaders of society continued to inspire people for centuries. Today, the Druids are remembered not only as figures from a distant past, but also as symbols of a lost world where nature, spirituality, and knowledge were deeply intertwined. The Druids were, in many ways, the embodiment of Celtic society itself, a society that valued wisdom, honor, and the sacredness of the natural world. Their role was not limited to religion or politics. They were the keepers of knowledge, the teachers, and the protectors of the land. In a world that is increasingly disconnected from nature, the Druids offer a reminder of a time when the forces of nature were revered and the wisdom of the past was passed down through the generations. While much of their practices and beliefs have been lost to history, the legacy of the Druids continues to captivate our imaginations, inspiring us to seek a deeper connection with the natural world and the mysteries that lie beyond. The wisdom of the Druids is one of the most captivating aspects of their legacy. To the Celts, the Druids were more than spiritual leaders. They were the living repositories of knowledge, keepers of sacred wisdom that had been passed down through generations. This knowledge was not simply intellectual, but was deeply rooted in the spiritual and natural world. The Druids possessed an understanding of the cosmos, the forces of nature, the mysteries of life and death, and the hidden connections between all things. This profound connection to the world around them made the Druids both revered and mysterious. Figures of immense power who, in many ways, bridged the gap between the known and the unknown. One of the most remarkable features of Druidic wisdom was the way it was preserved and transmitted. Unlike other ancient societies that recorded their knowledge in written form, the Druids relied on an oral tradition. Their teachings were passed down through memorization, recitation, and personal instruction. This method of transmission was sacred and deliberate, designed to ensure that knowledge was not diluted or misunderstood. The very act of memorizing long and complex texts was seen as a spiritual practice, a way of connecting more deeply with the knowledge itself. The oral tradition also meant that the knowledge was closely guarded by the Druids, and outsiders were rarely allowed access to their teachings. Only those chosen to be initiated into the Druidic order were entrusted with the wisdom of the ancestors, and these initiates underwent rigorous training before they could begin to understand the full depth of the Druidic worldview. The scope of Druidic knowledge was vast, encompassing many different disciplines. One of the central aspects of Druidic wisdom was their understanding of nature. The Druids saw the natural world not just as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred, interconnected system of forces. They believed that everything in nature, the trees, the rivers, the animals, the earth itself, was imbued with spiritual significance. This animistic worldview placed the Druids in a unique position, as they were the ones who could interpret the messages of nature and communicate with the divine forces that resided within it. Their connection to nature was not just theoretical, it was a lived experience, as the Druids often performed their rituals and ceremonies in sacred groves, near trees, and by the water, where they felt the presence of the divine most strongly. The oak tree was particularly sacred to the Druids, and it symbolized strength, endurance, and wisdom. The Druidic connection to the oak was so profound that the term Druid itself is thought to be derived from the Celtic word Druid, meaning oak knower. The Druids believed that the oak tree was a conduit to the divine, and they used it in their rituals and ceremonies to communicate with the gods. The importance of the oak tree was reflected in the way the Druids structured their rituals. For example, the ceremonial practice of oak drawing, in which the Druids would gather sacred branches from the oak tree, was believed to be a powerful act of connecting with the divine energy of the forest. In addition to their knowledge of nature, the Druids were also skilled in other areas, such as astronomy and the study of the stars. They were keen observers of the heavens, and their understanding of the movements of celestial bodies was far advanced for their time. The Druids believed that the cycles of the moon and the stars were not random, but were deeply connected to the rhythms of life on Earth. They used this knowledge to predict the changing seasons, the timing of harvest, and the best times to perform rituals. The alignment of the stars and planets was seen as a reflection of the divine order of the universe, and the Druids saw themselves as interpreters of this cosmic order. Their role as sky watchers was intertwined with their spiritual duties, as they believed that the stars could offer insights into the will of the gods and provide guidance for earthly matters. This understanding of astronomy was not limited to mere observation. It was intimately connected to their practices of divination. The Druids used various forms of divination to interpret the will of the gods and gain insights into the future. One of the most famous forms of Druidic divination involved the use of the yew tree, which was considered sacred. The Druids believed that the yew tree had the ability to bridge the gap between the mortal and spiritual worlds, and they would often use its branches and seeds in rituals designed to divine the future. This form of divination was deeply symbolic, as the yew tree was also associated with death and rebirth, reflecting the cyclical nature of existence. Herbalism and healing arts were another area where the Druids excelled. The Druids possessed a deep knowledge of plants and herbs, and they were considered master healers. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, and it was believed to be a form of sacred wisdom. The Druids were highly skilled in the use of medicinal plants to treat a wide range of ailments, from common illnesses to more serious conditions. Their healing practices were holistic, considering not only the physical symptoms, but also the spiritual and emotional well-being of the patient. The use of herbs and plants was also tied to the Druidic understanding of the natural world as sacred, and healing was seen as a way of restoring balance between the human body and the forces of nature. The Druids' knowledge was not confined to the natural world. They were also scholars of law, history, and philosophy. They were responsible for preserving the history and genealogies of the Celtic tribes, passing down stories of great battles, heroic figures, and the divine origins of their people. This oral tradition was crucial for maintaining the cultural identity of the Celts, as it ensured that the stories of their ancestors would not be forgotten. The Druids also played an important role in settling disputes and maintaining social order. They acted as judges and mediators, ensuring that justice was done according to the sacred laws of the Celts. These laws were based on principles of fairness, honor, and respect for the natural world, and it was the Druids who upheld these values. Despite their vast knowledge, the Druids were also deeply connected to the mysteries of life and death. They believed that death was not an end but a transition, and that the soul continued to exist in another realm. This belief in the afterlife was central to their worldview, and it influenced many of their rituals and practices. The Druids were thought to possess the ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead, and they used their knowledge of the spiritual realm to guide the living. They also believed in the concept of reincarnation, seeing life as a cyclical process in which the soul was reborn in different forms. This belief in the continuity of life and death gave the Druids a unique perspective on the nature of existence and the relationship between the human soul and the divine. The breadth of Druidic wisdom was not only impressive but also deeply spiritual. The Druids were not just intellectuals. They were mystics who saw the world as a reflection of the divine. Their knowledge was rooted in a profound sense of reverence for the natural world and the unseen forces that governed it. They believed that true wisdom came from a deep connection with the divine and with nature, and that the pursuit of knowledge was not an end in itself, but a means of aligning oneself with the cosmic order. While much of the Druidic knowledge has been lost to history, its legacy endures. The Druids were the keepers of an ancient wisdom that transcended time and place, and their influence can still be felt today in various forms of modern spirituality, particularly in movements that emphasize a connection to nature, the cycles of the seasons, and the mysteries of the universe. The Druids were not just figures of the past, but symbols of a way of life that valued wisdom, harmony, and respect for the natural world. Their teachings, passed down to the generations, continue to inspire those who seek a deeper understanding of the mysteries of existence. As we continue to explore the history and legacy of the Druids, we will see how their wisdom was intertwined with their spirituality, their understanding of nature, and their role as leaders of their people. The Druids were not merely guardians of knowledge. They were also the spiritual guides who helped their people navigate the complexities of life, death, and the unknown. In many ways, the wisdom of the Druids can be seen as a reminder of the deep connections that exist between all living things, and profound mysteries that still await discovery. Druidic rituals and practices form the heart of the Druidic tradition, offering a glimpse into the spiritual and cultural world of the ancient Celts. These rituals, conducted by the Druids themselves, were not mere formalities but sacred acts that connected the physical and spiritual realms. They were designed to honor the natural world, invoke the divine, and maintain balance in both the universe and within the lives of the people they served. The ceremonies performed by the Druids were meant to reflect the harmony and interconnectedness of all things, human, divine, and natural. Through their rituals, the Druids sought to align themselves with the rhythms of the earth, the changing of the seasons, and the cycles of life and death. One of the most important aspects of Druidic rituals was their deep connection to the cycles of nature. The Celts believed that the world was governed by natural laws and forces, and that to live in harmony with these forces was to live in accordance with the divine order. The Druids, as spiritual leaders, were the ones who understood these laws and could interpret the will of the gods through their rituals. The Druidic calendar was intricately tied to the changing seasons, the phases of the moon, and the solstices and equinoxes. The rituals performed at these times were designed to honor the cycles of life, celebrate the turning of the year, and maintain the flow of natural energy that sustained the world. The most significant of these rituals were those held at the four major Celtic festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. These festivals marked the changing of the seasons, and were celebrated with great reverence and ceremony. Each of these festivals had its own specific significance and was meant to honor different aspects of nature and the spiritual world. Imbolc, celebrated on February 1st, marked the beginning of spring and the awakening of the earth after the cold winter months. This festival was dedicated to the goddess Brigid, who was associated with fire, fertility, and healing. The Druids would light fires to symbolize the return of warmth and light, and rituals would often involve cleansing, purification, and the planting of seeds. It was a time of renewal, both for the land and for the people, and was seen as an opportunity to cleanse oneself of past mistakes and begin anew. Beltane, which took place on May 1st, was one of the most important and widely celebrated of the Druidic festivals. It marked the beginning of summer and was a time to celebrate fertility, growth, and vitality. The highlight of Beltane was the lighting of the sacred fires, which symbolized the sun's power and the life-giving energy of the earth. People would gather around the fire, dancing and singing, to invoke blessings for a prosperous and abundant year. One of the most famous customs of Beltane was the creation of the maypole, a ritual that involved weaving ribbons around a tall pole, symbolizing the union of the masculine and feminine energies and a renewal of life. Lugnasad, celebrated on August 1st, was a festival of the first harvest. It was a time to give thanks for the abundance of the earth and to offer sacrifices in return for fertility of the land. The Druids would perform rituals to honor the earth's bounty, and it was common for offerings of food, drink, and crops to be placed on altars as a sign of gratitude. This festival also marked the beginning of the harvest season and was a time to prepare for the coming winter. It was a time of balance, recognizing the cycle of life and death, and acknowledging that the bounty of the earth came with the understanding that nothing in life is permanent. Samhain, celebrated on October 31st, marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. It was one of the most sacred times of the year, as it was believed that the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world was at its thinnest. During Samhain, the Druids would perform elaborate rituals to honor the dead and seek protection for the coming winter months. Bonfires were lit to guide the spirits of the deceased, and offerings were made to ensure that the dead would not cause harm. It was a time for reflection, remembrance, and communion with the ancestors, and the rituals performed during Samhain were believed to protect the tribe from evil spirits and ensure that the harvest would sustain them to the cold months ahead. These four festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, and Samhain, formed the backbone of the Druidic year, and their rituals were an essential part of the spiritual life of the Celts. But the festivals were not the only occasions for Druidic rituals. The Druids also performed smaller, more intimate ceremonies throughout the year, often in sacred groves or at holy sites. These rituals were designed to mark personal milestones, such as births, marriages, and deaths, as well as to seek divine guidance during times of uncertainty. The rituals were typically performed in natural settings, as the Druids believed that the energy of the earth could be harnessed in these sacred spaces to amplify the power of their prayers and invocations. A central aspect of many Druidic rituals was the use of offerings and sacrifices. Offerings were made to the gods, spirits, and ancestors in the form of food, drink, and symbolic items. These offerings were meant to express gratitude, seek blessings, and maintain balance with the divine forces. While the most sensationalized accounts of Druidic sacrifices often suggest that humans were sacrificed in some rituals, most scholars believe that animal sacrifices, such as the offering of bulls or pigs, were more common. These sacrifices were not seen as acts of violence, but as necessary rites to honor the gods and maintain harmony in the natural world. The sacrifices were believed to be a way of giving back to the earth and ensuring the continued fertility of the land. The Druids also employed various forms of divination in their rituals. Divination was the practice of seeking knowledge or guidance from the divine through symbolic means. One of the most well-known forms of Druidic divination was a reading of omens from the natural world. The Druids would observe the flight patterns of birds, the behavior of animals, or the movement of clouds, interpreting these signs as messages from the gods. Another form of divination involved the use of sacred objects, such as the casting of lots or the reading of the entrails of sacrificed animals. These divinatory practices were intended to provide guidance for both personal decisions and larger tribal matters, such as whether to go to war or when to plant crops. Sacred objects played a significant role in Druidic rituals as well. The Druids were believed to possess powerful items, such as wands, staffs, and cauldrons, which were imbued with spiritual significance. These objects were used in ceremonies to channel the divine energy and to enhance the power of the rituals. The cauldron, in particular, was a symbol of abundance and transformation, and it was believed to have the power to heal, grant wisdom, and even bring the dead back to life in some myths. The use of these sacred objects helped to create a connection between the physical world and the divine, allowing the Druids to serve as intermediaries between the two realms. The rituals of the Druids were not only about seeking favor from the gods, but also about maintaining the balance of the natural world. The Celts saw the world as an interconnected web of relationships, where every living being had a role to play. The Druids, through their rituals, helped to ensure that this balance was maintained. They understood that the forces of nature, life and death, growth and decay, were in constant motion, and their role was to guide their people through these cycles with wisdom, respect, and reverence. Although much of Druidic ritual has been lost time, the fragments that remain offer a window into a deeply spiritual and harmonious worldview. The Druids' rituals were not simply acts of religious observance. They were expressions of the Celts' profound connection to the earth, the heavens, and the spirits of their ancestors. These ceremonies were vital to the survival and well-being of the Celtic people, providing them with a sense of continuity, purpose, and alignment with the natural world. Through their rituals, the Druids helped to create a world where the sacred and the mundane were inseparably linked, where the divine was present in every leaf, every stone, every star in the sky. As we reflect on these ancient rituals and practices, we can see the Druids not just as religious leaders, but as custodians of a way of life that honored the cycles of nature and sought balance between the material and the spiritual. Their rituals, designed to honor the divine forces that govern the world, were a testament to the wisdom they held and their deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. The decline of the Druids is one of the most tragic and poignant chapters in the history of ancient spiritual traditions. The Druids, once the powerful spiritual leaders, judges, and healers of the Celtic world, gradually faded into obscurity over the course of several centuries, their influence diminished by a combination of external forces and internal changes. Though the Druids themselves believed in the cyclical nature of life and death, the loss of their sacred practices marked the end of an era in Celtic history, and the echoes of their once great influence still reverberate through the myths, legends, and spiritual practices of today. The rise of the Roman Empire played a significant role in the decline of the Druids. As the Romans expanded their territories and sought to bring the diverse peoples they conquered into the fold of Roman civilization, they also attempted to impose their own system of beliefs, laws, and culture. The Celts, with their deeply ingrained spiritual practices and the central role of the Druids in their societies, were seen as an obstacle to this process of Romanization. The Druids, who held immense power and influence, represented an alternative spiritual system that was fundamentally opposed to Roman traditions. For the Romans, eliminating the Druids was not just about suppressing a religious group. It was about consolidating power and ensuring the dominance of Roman culture across the empire. The Roman historian Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, provides some of the earliest written accounts of the Druids, though his descriptions are often colored by his own biases and political agenda. Caesar describes the Druids as a dangerous force, warning that their influence over the Celtic tribes posed a threat to Roman rule. In Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Caesar famously claims that the Druids were responsible for inciting resistance against Roman conquest and were involved in rituals that the Romans found both mysterious and unsettling. He presents them as a group that stood in direct opposition to Roman authority and religious practices, making them a target for Roman suppression. As the Roman legions advanced across Gaul, Britain, and other parts of the Celtic world, they began systematically targeting Druidic strongholds. Sacred groves, altars, and ritual sites were destroyed or repurposed for Roman use. In some areas, the Druids themselves were hunted down, captured, and killed. The Romans sought to erase the Druidic tradition, viewing it as both a spiritual and political threat. In Gaul, which was conquered by Caesar in the mid-1st century BCE, many Druids were either killed in battle or executed as part of the Roman campaign. The invasion of Britain in 43 CE, led by Emperor Claudius, also marked a decisive blow to the Druids, particularly as their sacred center on the island of Mona, present-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales, was attacked and destroyed by the Romans. The Romans were not content with simply defeating the Druids in battle. They sought to dismantle the very foundation of Druidic influence. The Roman authorities actively banned Druidic practices and rituals, ordering that their sacred groves and sites of worship be razed. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century CE, describes how the Romans, under the orders of Emperor Suetonius Paulinus, launched a brutal campaign against the Druidic stronghold on Mona in 60 CE. Tacitus writes that the Druids, who had been gathering in the sacred groves to offer resistance to Roman rule, were massacred and their holy sites desecrated. According to Tacitus, the Romans saw this as a necessary step in securing their dominance over the Celtic peoples, and the destruction of the Druids was symbolic of their total control over the region. With the Roman successful suppression of the Druids, their role in Celtic society began to erode. The cultural and spiritual framework that had sustained the Druids for centuries was gradually replaced by Roman religious practices and governance. Roman gods, temples, and rituals began to take hold in the territories once dominated by the Celts, and the Druids were marginalized, their influence slowly fading from political and religious life of the region. As Roman laws, customs, and beliefs spread, the Celtic people increasingly adopted Roman ways of life, leaving behind many of their traditional practices, including those associated with the Druids. While the Romans were responsible for much of the initial decline of Druidic power, the rise of Christianity in the early centuries of the Common Era also played a pivotal role in the Druids' demise. Christianity, which spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire after the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century CE, was fundamentally at odds with the polytheistic, animistic beliefs of the Celts and their Druidic practices. The Christian Church viewed the Druids as a direct threat to the new faith, and many early Christian missionaries, such as St. Patrick in Ireland, worked to eradicate Druidic influence by converting the Celts to Christianity. In the 5th and 6th century CE, as Christianity became more entrenched in Europe, Druidic practices were increasingly condemned as pagan and heretical. The Christian Church sought to replace the old Celtic gods with Christian saints, and to establish churches where Druidic sacred sites once stood. Sacred groves, once places of spiritual communion with nature, were now converted into Christian holy sites. The old festivals, which had been central to Druidic practice, were gradually replaced by Christian holidays, and many of the rituals associated with the Druids were lost or forgotten. The power of the Druids, once revered as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, was eclipsed by the spread of Christian doctrine. Despite these efforts to suppress Druidic beliefs, elements of the old traditions persisted in various forms. In some remote regions of Celtic lands, particularly in Ireland and Wales, Druidic customs continued to influence local religious practices for centuries. The figure of the Druid, though no longer holding the same authoritative power, remained a symbol of wisdom and mysticism in folklore and mythology. Stories of wise Druids, capable of shaping the future and communicating with the gods, lived on in the tales of King Arthur and other Celtic myths. Even as the Druids disappeared from the historical record, their influence remained embedded in the collective consciousness of the Celtic people, who continued to honor their ancestral wisdom in more subtle ways. The final blows to the Druidic tradition came in the form of widespread cultural and religious shifts. As Christianity became the dominant faith across Europe, many aspects of Druidic spirituality, such as a reverence for nature, the belief in the sacredness of trees, and the practice of ritual offerings, were slowly absorbed into the Christian faith in more symbolic forms. The sacred groves of the Druids became Christian churches, and the figures of Druidic wisdom were transformed into saints and holy figures. Yet, despite the best efforts to stamp out their legacy, the memory of the Druids continued to inspire new generations, particularly in the Romantic and medieval periods, when there was a resurgence of interest in ancient traditions and folklore. The historical decline of the Druids, while tragic, marks the end of a chapter in Celtic history. However, their influence persists in the myths and legends that continue to be told, in the modern neo-pagan movements that seek to reclaim their spiritual practices, and the fascination that the figure of the Druid continues to hold over the human imagination. The Druids may have vanished from the stage of history, but their legacy is not forgotten. Their wisdom, their rituals, and their deep connection to the natural world continue to inspire those who seek to understand the mysteries of life, death, and the universe. The decline of the Druids represents not just the loss of a spiritual and cultural tradition, but the transformation of an entire worldview. The Druids, who lived in a world where nature, spirituality, and knowledge were deeply interconnected, became the victims of forces that sought to separate these aspects of life. But in the shadows of history, the wisdom of the Druids endures, and their legacy lives on the landscapes they once revered and the stories that continue to be told about them. Though the Druids themselves disappeared from the historical stage centuries ago, their influence is far from extinguished. In fact, the legacy of the Druids has had a remarkable resurgence in modern times, manifesting in a variety of forms, from spiritual practices to cultural movements, and even in popular media. The image of the Druid as a wise, nature-connected mystic continues to captivate the imagination of many, and their principles of wisdom, reverence for nature, and connection to the spiritual world are still valued today by a growing number of individuals and communities. This section will explore the multifaceted ways in which the legacy of the Druids endures, and how their ancient practices and ideals continue to inspire contemporary culture. The revival of Druidic practices can be traced in part to the broader modern interest in paganism and nature-based spirituality. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a period marked by growing interest in ancient traditions, several groups began taking active interest in the religious and spiritual practices of the Druids. The Romantic movement, which emphasized the beauty and wisdom of ancient cultures, played a significant role in reviving interest in the Celts and their Druids. Intellectuals, poets, and artists sought to reconnect with the past, and they found inspiration in the idea of the Druid as a symbol of ancient wisdom and a connection to the earth. This period saw the publication of works that romanticized Druidic culture and ideals, painting the Druids as noble guardians of a lost, pure spiritual tradition that existed in harmony with nature. One of the most notable periods of Druidic revival occurred in the late 17th and early 18th centuries in Britain and Ireland. During this time, there was a growing fascination with Celtic heritage, and many people began to seek out the forgotten spiritual practices of their ancestors. This revival was particularly strong in Ireland, where the legacy of the Druids was still keenly felt in folklore and local traditions. Many intellectuals and scholars in Ireland and beyond began to study ancient texts, exploring the possibility that Druidic rituals and beliefs had not completely vanished. This led to the formation of several organizations dedicated to the study and reconstruction of Druidic practices, one of the most famous being the Druid Order, established in 1717. The Druid Order and other similar societies aimed to revive the ancient practices of the Druids, although their approach was often a mixture of the historical and the mythical. These societies incorporated rituals, ceremonies, and symbols drawn from ancient Druidic traditions, but they also combined them with other spiritual ideas and practices from the broader Western esoteric tradition. The Druid Order, for example, adopted a ceremonial style of ritual that blended elements of Freemasonry and other secret societies with the idea of a Druidic priesthood. This was a time of experimentation, where the romanticized ideals of the Druids were synthesized with contemporary spiritual movements, leading to a revival of interest in Druidic symbolism, philosophy, and practices. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this revival was the establishment of modern Druidry as a form of nature-based spirituality. Modern Druidry, which draws heavily from ancient Druidic teachings, is a contemporary spiritual movement that emphasizes living in harmony with the earth, cultivating wisdom, and connected with the divine in all aspects of life. This form of Druidry is highly inclusive, drawing on elements of Celtic mythology, Wicca, and various forms of neo-paganism, as well as other nature-based spiritual traditions. Its core tenets include a deep respect for nature, a commitment to environmental stewardship, and a belief in the sacredness of the natural world. Modern Druids often gather in groups or circles to perform rituals, celebrate the changing of the seasons, and honor the cycles of life, much as the ancient Druids did. The role of nature and the natural world in modern Druidry cannot be overstated. Just as the ancient Druids viewed nature as sacred, contemporary Druidry encourages its practitioners to form deep, meaningful connections with the earth and its ecosystems. This often includes activities such as tree planting, gardening, and forest bathing, as well as efforts to protect and preserve natural habitats. For many modern Druids, their spiritual practices are intrinsically linked to environmental activism. This modern incarnation of Druidry represents not just a return to ancient spiritual practices, but a reimagining of those practices in the context of the ecological crises of the 21st century. With climate change, habitat destruction, and environmental degradation threatening the planet, Druidic values of reverence for the earth have taken on a new, urgent significance. Beyond the realm of spiritual practices, the legacy of the Druids also lives on in popular culture. In literature, film, and television, Druids continue to be depicted as mystical, wise, and powerful figures. One of the most iconic representations of the Druids in modern media is the portrayal of the character of Merlin in Arthurian legend. Merlin, often depicted as a Druidic figure, has become one of the most enduring symbols of the wise and mysterious mentor. His connection to nature, his prophetic abilities, and his role as advisor to King Arthur all reflect qualities traditionally associated with the Druids. In contemporary retellings of the Arthurian myths, Merlin is often portrayed as a character with ancient, esoteric knowledge, much like the ancient Druids, and his ability to communicate with the forces of nature and the supernatural further ties him to the Druidic tradition. In addition to Merlin, Druids appear as characters in numerous fantasy novels, films, and video games. In these modern depictions, they are often shown as powerful spellcasters who wield magic derived from nature, the elements, and ancient wisdom. Popular works of fantasy, such as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter series, and the Witcher novels, feature Druidic-like characters who possess knowledge of nature, herbalism, and mystical rites. These portrayals tap into the deep-rooted archetypes of wisdom, power, and mystery associated with the Druids, reflecting society's continued fascination with their spiritual and mystical traditions. Another notable aspect of the Druidic legacy in modern culture is the way it has influenced neo-pagan and New Age movements. Modern witchcraft, Wicca, and other nature-based spiritual paths often incorporate elements of Druidic practice, particularly in their reverence of the earth, the use of rituals connected to the cycles of nature, and the celebration of festivals like the solstices and equinoxes. These traditions, while not strictly Druidic, share much in common with ancient Druidry, and many modern pagans look to the Druids as ancestors who carried forward a vital spiritual connection to the land. The fascination with the Druids also extends to the world of archaeology and historical scholarship. While much of the Druidic tradition was lost or deliberately suppressed by the Romans and later by the spread of Christianity, modern scholars have made significant efforts to reconstruct the lives and practices of the Druids through the study of ancient texts, archaeological sites, and Celtic mythology. In recent decades, there has been a growing interest in Druidic history, as scholars and enthusiasts alike seek to better understand the Druids' role in ancient society. Researchers have examined ancient burial sites, sacred groves, and standing stones, as well as the rich corpus of mythological and literary sources that mention the Druids, in an effort to piece together a more complete picture of their lives and their beliefs. This modern interest in the Druids has contributed to a broader movement of cultural preservation, as people seek to reconnect with their Celtic heritage and revitalize ancient spiritual practices. The growing popularity of Celtic festivals, the rise of pagan and neo-pagan communities, and increasing awareness of environmental and ecological issues have all helped to bring the Druidic legacy into the modern world. While the Druids themselves may have vanished from history, their principles of wisdom, reverence for nature, and respect for the cycles of life continue to inspire and shape the spiritual practices and cultural movements of the present day. The legacy of the Druids, in both its historical and modern forms, speaks to the enduring power of nature-based spirituality. Whether in the form of modern Druidry, popular culture representations, or the ongoing study of the practices, the influence of the Druids continues to captivate the human imagination. Their wisdom and connection to the earth resonate with people seeking a deeper, more meaningful relationship with the world around them, and their spiritual practices serve as a reminder of a time when the natural world was revered as sacred. Though the Druids themselves may no longer walk the earth, their teachings endure, carried forward by those who honor their legacy and seek to live in harmony with the natural rhythms of the universe. The Druids, as spiritual leaders and custodians of ancient wisdom, held a deep connection to symbols and sacred objects, each of which carried profound meaning and served as a conduit between the physical and spiritual realms. The symbols and objects used by the Druids were not merely ornamental. They were believed to embody divine energy and carry spiritual significance, representing various forces of nature, the cycles of life, and the connection between the human and divine worlds. Through the careful use of these symbols and objects, the Druids maintained their sacred relationship with the natural world and invoked the spiritual forces they revered. At the heart of Druidic symbolism was a profound reverence for nature. The natural world was seen as both sacred and symbolic, with every element of the landscape, trees, animals, stones, rivers, and the heavens, imbued with spiritual meaning. The Druids did not merely observe nature. They understood it as a living, interconnected web, with each element possessing its own spiritual essence. Many of their symbols reflected these beliefs, and the sacred objects they used in rituals and ceremonies were designed to facilitate a deeper connection with the natural world and the divine forces that shaped it. One of the most important symbols associated with the Druids was the oak tree. The oak was considered the sacred tree of the Druids, and its significance is reflected in the very name of the order. Druid is believed to be derived from the Celtic word druid, meaning oak knower or oak wise. The oak tree represented strength, endurance, wisdom, and divine connection. It was believed that the oak was a conduit to the gods, and sacred ceremonies were often held in oak groves, which were seen as portals to the divine world. The oak's massive, enduring nature symbolized the stability of the cosmic order and the deep-rooted connection between the earth and the heavens. The Druids also placed great importance on other trees, each of which carried its own symbolic meaning. For example, the yew tree was associated with death, immortality, and rebirth. The yew's ability to live for thousands of years made it a symbol of the eternal cycle of life and death. In Druidic rituals, the yew was often used in divination practices, and it's what was considered sacred. Holly, another tree closely tied to Druidic symbolism, represented protection, defense, and renewal. It was believed to be a guardian tree, one that offered strength and resilience during difficult times, especially during the dark winter months. The Druids were also deeply connected to the sun and moon, which played significant roles in their spiritual practices. The sun, with its life-giving energy, was seen as a symbol of divine illumination, knowledge, and power. The Druids observed the movement of the sun, using its cycles to mark the changing seasons and to align their rituals with the cosmic order. The solstices, the winter and summer solstices, were particularly important as they represented the turning points of the year, when light and dark were in balance. The Druids held elaborate ceremonies at these times to honor the sun and its role in the natural world. The moon, on the other hand, was associated with the mysteries of the feminine, the cycles of time, and the ebb and flow of energy. The phases of the moon were used to track the passage of time and were integral to Druidic rituals, especially in matters of fertility, growth, and renewal. In addition to natural symbols, the Druids employed various sacred objects that were used in rituals, divination, and healing. One of the most iconic of these objects was the cauldron. The cauldron was a symbol of abundance, transformation, and spiritual nourishment. It was believed to have the power to grant wisdom, heal the sick, and even bring the dead back to life, a belief reflected in several Celtic myths. The cauldron was a central feature of many Druidic rituals, where it was filled with offering symbolic foods and sacred liquids. The act of pouring or consuming from the cauldron represented the act of receiving divine blessings and sustaining life. The wand or staff was another sacred object that played a vital role in Druidic ceremonies. Wands were used by the Druids to channel spiritual energy and communicate with the divine. These wands were typically made from wood that had spiritual significance, such as oak, yew, or willow. The wand represented the Druids' power to influence the world and the forces of nature, and it was used in rituals to invoke the gods, bless individuals, or bring about transformation. Wands were often inscribed with symbols, such as runes or ogham characters, that further imbued them with magical properties. Another key object in Druidic rituals was a sacred knife or thame. This tool was used in many of their ceremonies, especially those involving the cutting of offerings or the creation of sacred spaces. The thame, typically a black-handled knife, represented the element of air and was used to carve symbols, prepare altars, or symbolize the power of the Druid in directing the flow of energy. It was a tool of spiritual precision, helping the Druid focus their intentions and channel divine power into the ritual. Druidic stones also held significant symbolic value. The Druids believed that stones were repositories of ancient knowledge and spiritual power, often using standing stones or stone circles in their rituals. These stones were seen as markers of sacred space and time, often aligned with celestial bodies to harness their cosmic energy. Stone circles, like those at Stonehenge, are believed to have been places of Druidic worship and astronomical observation. These ancient structures were thought to align with the solstices and equinoxes, marking important turning points in the year. The stones themselves were considered sacred, and rituals conducted at these sites were believed to have a powerful connection to the natural world and the divine. The sacred fire was another powerful symbol in Druidic practice. Fire represented the divine spark of life, illumination, and transformation. It was believed to have purifying qualities, and many Druidic rituals involved the lighting of sacred fires. These fires were often lit during major festivals like Beltane, Samhain, and the solstices. The fire served as a focal point for rituals, around which participants would gather to seek blessings, protection, and spiritual enlightenment. The lighting of the fire also symbolized the return of light during the dark winter months and the renewal of life during the spring and summer seasons. In addition to these natural and sacred objects, the Druids used divinatory tools to gain insight into the future and to communicate with the gods. One of the most famous divinatory systems associated with the Druids was the Ogham alphabet. The Ogham script, which consists of a series of lines and markings, was believed to be a form of communication with the spirit world. Each Ogham symbol was associated with a specific tree, and these symbols were used to interpret the messages of the divine. The Druids would often use Ogham as part of their divination practices, casting the symbols in sacred patterns to gain insight into future events or to make important decisions. Another form of divination used by the Druids was rune casting. Runes, like the Ogham symbols, were inscribed on stones or wooden sticks and cast during rituals to communicate with the gods. The patterns in which the runes fell were interpreted to provide guidance on matters ranging from personal decisions to the fate of entire communities. These forms of divination were integral to the Druidic role as mediators between the divine and the mortal world, allowing them to interpret the will of the gods and offer guidance to their people. The sacred bell was another object used by the Druids in their rituals. Bells were thought to have the power to summon the spirits and call the attention of the divine. The ringing of the bell was seen as a sacred act that brought the participants into a heightened state of awareness, aligning them with the spiritual forces present in the ritual. It was used to mark the beginning of a ceremony, as well as to invoke blessings and protection from the gods. Druidic symbols and sacred objects were not just tools for ritual, they were embodiments of a deeper spiritual connection to the natural and divine worlds. Each symbol, each object, was a manifestation of the cosmic order, representing the balance between life and death, the seen and the unseen, the human and the divine. Through the careful use of these symbols and objects, the Druids were able to maintain their role as spiritual guides and keepers of ancient wisdom, channeling the forces of nature and the cosmos into their rituals and practices. In modern times, these ancient symbols and objects continue to hold meaning for those who seek to reconnect with the wisdom of the Druids. From the resurgence of Druidic spirituality to the study of ancient symbols in archaeological and esoteric circles, the legacy of Druidic symbols remains a powerful reminder of the ancient connection between humanity and the natural world. Whether through the symbolic use of trees, the sacred fire, or the powerful cauldron, the objects and symbols of the Druids continue to inspire and guide those who seek to live in harmony with the earth and the divine. The ancient practices of the Druids, though largely obscured by the passage of time and the pressures of political, religious, and cultural shifts, continue to exert profound influence on modern spiritual and religious movements. These ancient spiritual leaders, who once guided their communities through rituals deeply connected to nature, the cycles of life, and the divine, have left a legacy that resonates with contemporary seekers of wisdom, meaning, and spiritual alignment with the natural world. Today, many people turn to Druidic traditions as a source of spiritual guidance, environmental stewardship, and personal transformation. From neo-pagan movements to eco-spiritual practices, the teachings and ideals of the Druids are being reinterpreted and reintegrated into modern life in ways that honor both the ancient roots of the tradition and the contemporary concerns of the world. One of the most prominent ways in which Druidic influence manifests today is in the practice of modern Druidry. Modern Druidry is a spiritual movement that draws on ancient Celtic wisdom, especially the beliefs, rituals, and reverence for nature that were central to Druidic traditions. The movement, which began to take shape during the 18th and 19th centuries, has evolved significantly in recent decades, incorporating elements of contemporary environmentalism, personal empowerment, and holistic healing. Modern Druidry is not a monolithic belief system, but rather a diverse and evolving set of practices and philosophies that share a common commitment to honoring the earth, seeking spiritual enlightenment, and living in harmony with the rhythms of nature. The central tenet of modern Druidry is the reverence for the natural world. Just as the ancient Druids saw themselves as the guardians of sacred groves, rivers, and landscapes, modern Druids view nature as the ultimate spiritual teacher. They believe that the divine is present in all aspects of the natural world, from the trees and the rocks to the sun and the moon, and that humans have a responsibility to honor, protect, and live in balance with the earth. Many modern Druids engage in practices such as walking in nature, forest bathing, and communing with the elements as a way of deepening their connection to the land and its spiritual significance. Rituals are often held in natural settings, such as woodlands, meadows, and by the sea, to create a sacred space where participants can attune themselves to the energies of the earth and the cosmos. A key aspect of modern Druidry is the celebration of the Wheel of the Year, a calendar based on the changing of the seasons. This calendar, which mirrors the cycle of life, is divided into 8 festivals that correspond to the solstices, equinoxes, and the midpoints between them. These festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain, are deeply rooted in the ancient practices of the Druids and continue to serve as focal points for contemporary Druidic ceremonies. Each of these festivals celebrates a different aspect of nature's cycles, from the return of light at Imbolc to the harvest festivals of Lughnasadh and the honoring of ancestors at Samhain. Modern Druids mark these festivals with feasts, rituals, and ceremonies that not only celebrate the seasons, but also honor the spiritual forces that govern life, death, and rebirth. In addition to the Wheel of the Year, modern Druidic practice places a significant emphasis on meditation, visualization, and personal transformation. Many contemporary Druids engage in meditation practices that involve connecting with nature, invoking the elements, or seeking guidance from the divine. Through these practices, individuals seek to cultivate inner peace, self-awareness, and spiritual clarity. Modern Druidry also emphasizes the importance of personal empowerment, with practitioners encouraged to develop their own relationship with the divine and to trust their intuition as a source of wisdom. This aspect of modern Druidry is not only about honoring the external world, but also about fostering growth and healing within the individual. The influence of Druidic practices is also evident in the resurgence of paganism and neo-pagan movements, many of which have drawn inspiration from the ancient Druids. Neo-paganism, which is an umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of spiritual practices, seeks to reconnect modern people with the earth, the cycles of nature, and the divine feminine. While neo-paganism is not a single, unified tradition, many of its practitioners share a common belief in the sacredness of nature and the use of ritual to align oneself with the forces of the universe. The roots of modern paganism can be traced to the same ancient traditions that inspired Druidry, and many pagan practitioners look to the Druids as spiritual ancestors. The belief in the interconnection of all living beings, the reverence for the elements, and the focus on seasonal festivals are all hallmarks of both Druidic and neo-pagan practices. A significant element of neo-paganism that bears the mark of Druidic influence is the concept of divination. The Druids, as spiritual leaders, were renowned for their ability to interpret the will of the gods through divinatory practices. This tradition has been carried forward into modern paganism, where divination remains a central practice for many. Whether through the use of runes, tarot cards, or astrology, modern practitioners of neo-paganism often seek to gain insight into their lives, make decisions, and connect with the divine through divination. This practice of seeking divine guidance echoes the Druidic traditions of reading signs in nature, interpreting omens, and using sacred tools to communicate with the unseen world. Another notable area where Druidic influence is felt today is in eco-spirituality and the growing environmental movement. Modern Druidry's commitment to protecting the earth and living in harmony with nature is closely aligned with contemporary concerns about environmental degradation, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. Many modern Druids and practitioners of nature-based spiritualities see their work as a form of environmental activism, seeking not only to protect the planet, but also to awaken others to the sacredness of the natural world. This commitment to the earth is expressed through both practical actions, such as community gardening, tree planting, and conservation efforts, and through spiritual rituals that honor the earth as sacred. In this way, modern Druidry serves as a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary environmental issues, emphasizing the interconnectedness of all life and the need for sustainable living. The reclamation of feminine divine is another spiritual current in modern times that draws inspiration from Druidic traditions. The Druids, like many ancient cultures, revere the divine feminine, often represented by goddesses of fertility, the land, and the moon. In modern spiritual practices, particularly those of feminist and goddess spirituality, there has been a resurgence of interest in reclaiming the feminine aspects of the divine. This includes honoring the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth, and recognizing the earth as a living, nurturing entity. Modern Druids, particularly those who identify with the feminine aspect of spirituality, see the goddess as a vital force in the cosmos, one that embodies both the nurturing and destructive forces of nature. This reverence of the feminine divine is central to many contemporary Druidic rituals, where goddesses of the land, sea, and sky are invoked and honored. Modern Druidry also plays a role in personal healing and holistic health. Many practitioners look to Druidic teachings for guidance on physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The Druids, who were also healers, used plants, herbs, and natural remedies to care for the sick and maintain health. Today, there is a growing interest in herbalism, plant medicine, and natural healing practices that draw on Druidic traditions. Modern Druids may incorporate these practices into their spiritual rituals, using herbs and plants that are believed to have healing properties, such as oak and mistletoe. Additionally, many modern Druids practice energy healing, chakra balancing, and other holistic therapies as a means of restoring balance to the body, mind, and spirit. In the realm of personal empowerment, modern Druidry encourages individuals to find their own spiritual path. While the Druids of ancient times were leaders, guiding their communities, contemporary Druidic practices emphasize that each individual is their own spiritual authority. Practitioners are encouraged to seek wisdom from within, trust their intuition, and align themselves with the rhythms of nature in order to create lives of balance and purpose. Modern Druidry is thus not just a set of rituals, but a philosophy of self-discovery and personal transformation, where each person can find their unique connection to the divine and to the world around them. The legacy of the Druids, therefore, continues to live on in the spiritual practices of today. Whether through the revival of ancient rituals, the connection to the earth, the pursuit of personal healing, or the celebration of the divine feminine, the teachings of the Druids remain as relevant as ever. Their influence has transcended time and culture, finding expression in modern movements that honor nature, embrace holistic healing, and seek to create a deeper connection with the divine. Through these modern practices, the wisdom of the Druids continues to inspire and guide those who seek a more profound and meaningful relationship with the world around them. In ancient Celtic society, the figure of the Druid held a position of profound importance, one that transcended the boundaries of mere religious leadership. The Druids were more than just priests. They were sages, philosophers, judges, and healers, tasked with a wide array of responsibilities that permeated every aspect of life in Celtic communities. Their influence was not limited to spiritual guidance alone, but extended to legal matters, education, and the preservation of cultural traditions. The role of the Druid in Celtic society was multifaceted, and understanding this role requires an exploration of how the Druids maintained a delicate balance between the earthly and the divine, between law and spirituality, between tradition and innovation. At the heart of the Druidic role in Celtic society was their function as spiritual guides. The Druids were responsible for maintaining the religious life of the community, overseeing performance of rituals and ceremonies, and ensuring that the people remained in harmony with the natural and divine worlds. The ancient Celts believed that the gods and spirits were intimately connected to the land, and it was a Druid's responsibility to mediate between these forces and the people. Rituals conducted by the Druids marked the turning of the seasons, honored deities, and ensured the well-being of both the people and the land. These rituals were often held in sacred groves or natural sites, such as hills, rivers, and caves, places where the Celts believed the veil between the human and divine worlds was thinnest. The Druids, in their wisdom, were believed to be able to communicate with these divine forces, seeking their favor and guidance of the community. Beyond their spiritual duties, the Druids played a central role as judges and lawgivers within Celtic society. The Celts did not rely solely on written laws as we do today. Instead, their legal system was based on oral tradition, with laws being passed down through generations in the form of poetry, stories, and proverbs. The Druids, as keepers of these oral traditions, were the custodians of the law. They were responsible for interpreting and applying the law in a fair and just manner, resolving disputes, and ensuring that justice was served. Because the Druids were also seen as the closest to the divine, their judgments carried great weight, and their decisions were seen as binding not only on a personal level but also on a spiritual one. Their legal expertise covered a wide range of matters, from property disputes to questions of morality and ethics, and they were the final arbiters in matters that had profound societal or spiritual consequences. In addition to their legal and spiritual roles, the Druids were also the educators of their people. The education of the youth in Celtic society was primarily the responsibility of the Druids, who passed down knowledge through a rigorous system of oral training. This training was highly demanding, as the Druids were required to memorize vast amounts of knowledge, including mythological stories, legal codes, and astronomical observations. In this respect, the Druids were not only religious leaders but also philosophers and intellectuals, steeped in the arts of rhetoric, memory, and logic. They were the intellectual backbone of Celtic culture, ensuring that the wisdom of the past was preserved for future generations. Their role as educators also extended to the training of future generations of Druids, ensuring that the traditions and practices of their order will continue in perpetuity. The Druids' education was not limited to intellectual pursuits alone. They were also the healers of their communities. The Druids possessed a vast knowledge of herbs, plants, and natural remedies, and they were responsible for treating the sick and injured. In many ways, the Druids were akin to the medicine men and women found in other indigenous cultures, using natural substances to treat a wide range of ailments. Some of the plants they used, such as mistletoe and yew, were considered sacred and were believed to possess powerful healing properties. The Druids' role as healers was deeply intertwined with their spiritual duties, as they believed that the physical and spiritual realms were interconnected. Healing for the Druids was not just about curing illness, but also about restoring balance between the body, mind, and spirit. The Druids' influence on Celtic society also extended to the preservation of memory and culture. In a time before written records were common, the Druids were the repository of cultural knowledge, and it was through their teachings that Celtic mythology, history, and traditions were passed down. The bardic tradition, which was closely associated with the Druids, involved the recitation of epic tales, genealogies, and stories of heroes and gods. These bards, many of whom were themselves trained as Druids, played a crucial role in preserving the history of the Celtic people, ensuring that their cultural identity remained intact even in times of war or displacement. Through song, poetry, and storytelling, the Druids and bards kept the memory of the gods and heroes alive, serving as a link between the past and the present. The role of the Druid was not static. It evolved over time, particularly as external influences began to shape the Celtic world. With the rise of the Roman Empire and its expansion into Celtic territories, the Druids found themselves increasingly at odds with Roman culture and religion. The Romans, who saw their pantheon of gods and their imperial ideology as superior, viewed the Druids with suspicion and hostility. The Druids, in turn, resisted Romanization, seeing the Roman conquest as a threat to their cultural and spiritual way of life. This led to a series of confrontations between the Druids and Roman forces, with the most famous being the destruction of the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, by the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus in 60 CE. The Romans were particularly focused on dismantling the Druids' influence, viewing them as both a religious and political challenge to their rule. The suppression of the Druids by the Romans marked the beginning of the end for the Druidic order in the Western world. Despite the Roman suppression of Druidism, the role of the Druid continued to resonate in the myths, legends, and spiritual practices of the Celtic peoples. Even as the Druids were driven underground, their wisdom and teachings lived on through oral traditions, folklore, and the religious practices of Celts. The Druids' reverence for nature, their knowledge of the stars, and their role as mediators between the human and divine realms remained central to the Celtic worldview and continued to shape the cultural landscape long after the Druids had been silenced. In the centuries following the Roman conquest, the influence of the Druids was further diminished with the rise of Christianity, which sought to replace the old pagan beliefs with monotheism. However, the Christian Church did not completely erase the memory of the Druids. Instead, elements of Druidic thought were absorbed into the Christianized Celtic culture. In Ireland, for example, the figure of the Druid was often reimagined as a Christian saint or scholar, and many of the ancient sacred sites once used by the Druids were repurposed as Christian places of worship. The Druids' role as healers, judges, and spiritual leaders was replaced by Christian clergy, but the memory of their spiritual wisdom and their connection to the land remain alive in the folklore and traditions of the Celtic peoples. Today, the role of the Druid is no longer tied to the same societal structure as it was in ancient times, but the influence of the Druids persists in modern-day practices. The modern Druidry movement, which has experienced a resurgence in recent years, seeks to revive the ancient traditions of the Druids, focusing on a reverence for nature, the study of mythology, and the practice of seasonal rituals. Modern Druids also engage in practices such as meditation, divination, and community rituals that echo the ancient role of the Druid as a spiritual guide and teacher. While the Druids may no longer wield the same societal power they once did, their role as guardians of wisdom, nature, and the sacred continues to inspire those who seek to reconnect with the ancient rhythms of the earth. In conclusion, the Druids' role in Celtic society was vast and multifaceted, blending spirituality, law, education, healing, and cultural preservation into a singular and highly respected position. The Druids were not merely religious leaders, but served as the moral, intellectual, and spiritual compass of their communities. Their influence extended far beyond the confines of their sacred groves and ritual spaces, permeating the daily lives of the Celts and shaping the cultural and spiritual identity of their people. Though the Druids have long since faded from the historical record, their legacy continues to inspire and inform modern spiritual practices, ensuring that their role in the history of humanity is far from forgotten. The ancient world was a place where civilizations were constantly evolving, often through the interaction, sometimes violent, between competing empires and cultures. One of the most significant moments in the history of the Druids came with the rise and expansion of the Roman Empire. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands marked the beginning of a profound decline in Druidic practices, as the Romans viewed the Druids not only as a spiritual and religious threat, but also as a political one. This decline, however, was not immediate. The resistance of the Druids, their entrenched position in Celtic society, and the complex relationship between the Romans and the Celts ensured that the end of Druidic traditions was a slow and gradual process. Nevertheless, the Roman Empire spread throughout Europe, combined with the rise of Christianity in the centuries that followed, led to the gradual disappearance of the Druids from the historical record. The Roman Empire's relationship with the Druids began as early as the 1st century BC, when Julius Caesar, one of the most famous Roman generals and future emperor, first encountered the Celts in Gaul, modern-day France. Caesar's military campaigns in Gaul, which are famously chronicled in his work Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, provide one of the earliest references to the Druids. Caesar describes the Druids as a powerful and influential priestly class who held sway over the religious, educational, and judicial life of the Celtic peoples. The Druids, according to Caesar, were so revered that they had the ability to influence not just religious practices, but also the political fate of individuals and tribes. Their role as spiritual and moral leaders gave them immense influence in Celtic society, and their authority extended far beyond the confines of their sacred groves. Caesar's account, however, portrays the Druids as being part of a more primitive and superstitious religious order. His description, often biased and intended to justify Roman superiority, painted the Druids as backward and dangerous. As the Roman Empire expanded, it became clear that the Druids posed a significant challenge to Roman rule. Not only did they command respect and loyalty from the Celtic tribes, but they also represented a form of resistance to Romanization and imperial control. The Druids' deep connection to land, their resistance to foreign domination, and their ability to rally people around their religious and legal authority made them a threat to Roman imperial expansion. The Roman approach to the Druids was, therefore, one of suppression. The Roman Empire, known for its military might and cultural assimilation, sought to dismantle the Druidic influence in the territories it conquered. In 58 BCE, Caesar began his campaign against the Celtic tribes in Gaul, and by 52 BCE, he had successfully subdued most of the Gallic tribes. In the course of his conquests, Caesar sought to dismantle the power of the Druids, viewing them as an obstacle to Roman domination. He describes in his writings how he attempted to eradicate the Druidic priesthood by prohibiting their religious practices and attempting to undermine their influence over the Celtic people. It is believed that the Druids were actively involved in rallying the Celtic resistance against the Romans, with their leadership playing a crucial role in the defense of Celtic lands. The most decisive blow to the Druids came in 60 CE during the reign of the Roman Emperor Claudius. In a campaign against the Celtic tribes of Britain, the Romans targeted the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales, which was seen as a spiritual center of Druidic life in Britain. The Romans, led by the general Suetonius Paulinus, conducted a brutal attack on Mona, destroying sacred groves, killing Druidic priests, and forcing the remaining Druids to flee or submit to Roman authority. This event, known as the destruction of the Druidic stronghold at Mona, marked a symbolic and literal end to the Druidic order in Britain. The loss of Mona as a spiritual and political center significantly weakened Druidic influence in the region and sent a clear message that the Roman Empire would not tolerate any resistance to its imperial rule. However, the destruction of Mona did not mark the immediate end of Druidism. Despite the Roman military's efforts to eradicate Druidic practices, the traditions of the Druids persisted in certain areas for several centuries. It is likely that in the more remote parts of the Celtic world, such as in Ireland, parts of Wales, and among the Pictish peoples in Scotland, Druidic practices survived in secret, passed down through oral traditions. Although the Romans had succeeded in imposing their culture and religion on much of the Celtic world, there remained pockets of resistance where the ancient ways were preserved. Nevertheless, over the following centuries, the power and influence of the Druids continued to wane. The arrival of Christianity in Celtic lands further contributed to the decline of Druidic practices. Christianity, with its monotheistic focus and centralized authority, was fundamentally at odds with the polytheistic and decentralized nature of Druidic beliefs. The Christian Church saw the Druids as symbols of paganism, superstition, and heresy, and the process of Christianization throughout the Celtic world gradually replaced the old Druidic traditions with Christian teachings. In some cases, Christian missionaries directly targeted Druidic sacred sites, attempting to convert them into Christian places of worship. For example, many of the sacred groves and natural sites once used by the Druids became Christianized, with chapels and churches built on the same locations. As Christianity took hold, the Druids were increasingly relegated to the realm of myth and legend. The rise of Christian saints, who often replaced Druidic leaders as the spiritual guides of the people, marked the final blow to the Druidic order. Figures like St. Patrick in Ireland, who famously is credited with converting the Irish to Christianity, are often depicted in folklore as having actively fought against the old pagan ways. The stories of the Druids were gradually transformed into myths, with Druidic figures often appearing as wise but ultimately defeated adversaries to the Christian faith. In the Christian retellings, the Druids were portrayed as beings who clung to a fading and obsolete worldview, their power and wisdom overshadowed by the truth of Christ. Despite this gradual decline, the memory of the Druids endured in the cultural consciousness of the Celtic peoples. Elements of Druidic spirituality and wisdom persisted in folk traditions, local customs, and even in the literature of the Christian Middle Ages. The myths of Celtic deities, heroes, and sacred places, many of which have been preserved by the Druids, were reinterpreted and integrated into Christian folklore. The legacy of the Druids can still be seen in the emphasis on nature, cycles, and the spiritual importance of the land in Celtic Christianity. The Druidic influence, however, did not vanish entirely. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as European intellectuals began to rediscover ancient texts and cultures, there was a renewed interest in the Druids. Renaissance scholars and philosophers sought to reconnect with the wisdom of the ancients, and the Druids were often idealized as symbols of a lost mystical knowledge. This resurgence of interest led to the creation of various Druidic revival movements, particularly in Britain and Ireland, where people began to look back to the Druidic past as a source of spiritual inspiration. While these revivals were often romanticized and disconnected from the historical reality of the Druids, they nonetheless contributed to the preservation of the Druidic mythos and helped to keep the spirit of the ancient order alive. Today, the legacy of the Druids continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Modern Druidry, as practiced by contemporary groups and individuals, draws on the traditions of the ancient Druids, albeit with more symbolic and spiritual focus. These modern Druids often seek to reconnect with the natural world, honoring the cycles of nature and the wisdom of the earth. While the political and religious power of the Druids may have been erased by the Roman conquest and the rise of Christianity, the spiritual essence of their teachings endures in modern practices of environmentalism, neo-paganism, and holistic living. In conclusion, the decline of Druidic practices was a complex and multifaceted process that was shaped by the rise of the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, and the changing dynamics of Celtic society. Although the Druids' influence was significantly reduced through military conquest, religious oppression, and cultural assimilation, their legacy continued to echo through the ages. The transformation of the Druids from powerful spiritual and political figures into mythic symbols of wisdom and mystery reflects the enduring power of their culture and traditions, even as the historical reality of the Druidic order faded from the historical record. The ancient Druids, as a spiritual and intellectual elite of Celtic society, were not only custodians of religious rites and legal traditions, but also the keepers of a vast and complex body of myths and legends. These stories, passed down orally through generations, provided both a spiritual framework for community and a deep connection to the natural world, the gods, and the cosmic forces that govern the universe. Druidic myths were steeped in the belief that nature was not just a physical reality, but a divine and living entity, rich with spiritual significance. The stories told by the Druids intertwined the realms of the supernatural and the human, offering profound insights into the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. Celtic mythology, like Druidic tradition itself, was based on oral transmission, and as a result, the myths and legends surrounding the Druids were fluid, with variations from one region to another. These stories were told not only to entertain, but also to teach moral lessons, explain natural phenomena, and uphold cultural values. They were often told around campfires, during festivals, or at sacred sites, where the very act of storytelling was imbued with ritual significance. In these stories, the Druids were often portrayed as wise, mysterious figures with the ability to communicate with the gods, foretell the future, and wield great power over nature. One of the most well-known figures in Druidic mythology is Cernunnos, the horned god of fertility, the forest, and animals. Cernunnos is often depicted with antlers or horns, symbolizing his deep connection to the wild and untamed forces of nature. As the god of animals and the hunt, Cernunnos represented the balance of life and death within the natural world. He was also associated with prosperity and abundance, believed to govern the cycles of nature that brought growth and harvest. In Druidic lore, Cernunnos was often seen as a protector of the forest, its creatures, and fertility of the earth. The Druids would likely have performed rituals in his honor, seeking his blessings for the health of the land and the community. Another significant figure in Druidic mythology is Brigid, the goddess of healing, poetry, fertility, and craftsmanship. Brigid's influence was widespread in Celtic culture, and she was revered not only as a goddess of fertility and agriculture, but also as a deity associated with wisdom, poetry, and inspiration. In Druidic stories, Brigid often acts as a mediator between the divine and the human, guiding mortals in matters of creativity and spiritual growth. Her connection to the hearth and fire was also of great importance, as fire symbolized both the transformative and life-giving aspect of the divine. The Druidic festivals, particularly Imbolc, which marked the beginning of the agricultural year, were dedicated to Brigid, and she was honored through rituals that celebrated the renewal of life, the return of light, and the coming of spring. The mythological figure of Awen is another key concept in Druidic lore. Awen is a word that means inspiration or divine illumination, and in Druidic mythology, it is the essence of poetic and spiritual inspiration. The idea of Awen reflects the Druidic belief that true wisdom and knowledge come from a direct connection with the divine, often attained through rituals, contemplation, and deep attunement with nature. Awen is often represented as a flow of energy that moves through the mind and soul of the individual, awakening creativity and wisdom. The Druids believed that this divine inspiration could be channeled through their rituals, poetry, and music, and it was considered a sacred gift from the gods. In some versions of Druidic myth, Awen is personified as a god or spirit who grants insight and clarity to those worthy of receiving it. One of the most enduring Druidic myths involves the sacred groves and the mystical power attributed to these natural spaces. In many cultures, groves were seen as sacred places, and for the Celts, this was no exception. The sacred groves were the heart of Druidic activity, where important ceremonies and rituals took place. According to myth, these groves were not only sacred to gods, but also inhabited by spirits and ancestral beings. The Druids believed that the trees in these groves, particularly the oak, held powerful spiritual significance. The oak was considered the king of trees, symbolizing strength, endurance, and connection to the divine. The groves, then, were not simply places of worship. They were portals to the spiritual realm, where the Druids could communicate with the gods and the spirits of the ancestors. One particularly famous Druidic myth involves the sacred mistletoe, which was believed to hold mystical powers. According to legend, mistletoe was a plant that grew only on the oak tree, and it was regarded as a gift from the gods. The Druids would harvest mistletoe during the winter solstice, a time when the sun was reborn and the days began to lengthen. The mistletoe was believed to possess powerful healing properties, and it was used in various rituals to promote fertility, health, and protection. It was also thought to have the power to ward off evil spirits and bring about positive change. The harvesting of mistletoe was considered a sacred act, performed with great reverence and ceremony, and it symbolized the rejuvenation of life and the triumph of light over darkness. Another prominent aspect of Druidic mythology is the concept of the otherworld, a realm that existed alongside the physical world but was hidden from mortal view. The otherworld was often described as a place of eternal youth, beauty, and abundance, where the gods and spirits resided. In Druidic lore, the otherworld was not an abstract concept but a real, tangible place that could be accessed through certain rituals or mystical journeys. It was believed that the Druids had the ability to enter this otherworld through trance states, vision quests, or journeys into sacred landscapes. In some myths, the otherworld is portrayed as a land of peace and joy, while in others, it is a place of danger and mystery, where the souls of the dead reside or where gods and spirits test the living. The story of Taliesin, the legendary poet and seer, is one of the most famous Druidic myths and offers a glimpse into mystical power attributed to the Druids. Taliesin is said to have been a great prophet and poet who possessed the gift of awe, the divine inspiration that allowed him to compose profound and prophetic poetry. According to the myth, Taliesin was born after a magical transformation involving a cauldron of knowledge, and a spell cast by the Druidic sorceress Ceridwen. The cauldron, which symbolized wisdom and transformation, was said to have granted Taliesin his divine abilities. His story embodies the Druidic ideal of wisdom gained through mystical experiences and divine revelation, and he is often seen as a model of the Druidic pursuit of knowledge and spiritual insight. Another key figure in Druidic mythology is Danu, the great mother goddess of the Celtic pantheon. Danu is often seen as the progenitor of the Tuatha Danann, the legendary race of gods and goddesses who are central to Irish mythology. Danu represents the fertility of the earth, the power of creation, and the nurturing aspect of the divine feminine. She is often associated with the rivers and waters, which were sacred to the Druids, as they were believed to be channels of spiritual energy. In some versions of the myth, Danu is said to have birthed the first Druids, who were chosen to serve as her earthly representatives and communicate her will to the people. Her influence in Druidic myth underscores the deep connection between the Druids and the natural world, where their practices often focus on honoring the forces of creation and nurturing life. In addition to these deities and figures, Druidic mythology is filled with numerous stories of heroes, spirits, and otherworldly beings. These myths often involve the interplay between mortal humans and divine or supernatural entities. Heroes such as Cú Chulainn and Finn Mac Cumhaill, though not Druids themselves, were often depicted as having close relationships with the Druidic order and were aided by magical wisdom, prophecies, and the counsel of Druidic figures. The mystical connection between the Druids and the world of spirits, gods, and ancestors played a crucial role in shaping the landscape of Celtic mythology, reinforcing the belief that the natural world was a realm full of mystical significance, where the boundaries between the living and the divine were porous and ever-changing. The myths and legends of the Druids offer us a window into the spiritual and philosophical worldview of the ancient Celts. They reveal a profound reverence for nature, a belief in the interconnectedness of all life, and a deep understanding of the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. These stories were not only a means of preserving cultural history, but also a way of transmitting the values, beliefs, and spiritual wisdom that the Druids held dear. Even today, many of these myths continue to resonate with people seeking a deeper connection to the natural world, the divine, and the mysteries of existence. The ancient Druids held an unparalleled reverence for nature, viewing the natural world not just as a physical realm, but as a sacred domain where the divine manifested in all living things. For the Druids, nature was not merely the backdrop of their existence, but a very source of spiritual insight, wisdom, and power. They believed that every tree, every river, every mountain, and every creature was imbued with spiritual significance, and that through communion with the natural world, one could achieve a deeper understanding of the universe and their place within it. This profound connection to nature shaped the Druidic worldview and practices, and the role of nature in their spiritual life cannot be overstated. The connection between Druidic practices and nature was not simply symbolic or poetic. It was an integral and deeply experiential part of the Druidic tradition. At the heart of Druidic nature worship was a belief in the sacredness of trees. Trees were considered to be the bridge between the physical and spiritual realms, connecting the earth with the heavens. The Druids held a particular reverence for certain trees, especially the oak, which they regarded as the most sacred of all. The oak tree was seen as the embodiment of strength, endurance, and wisdom. In fact, the word Druid itself is thought to derive from the ancient Celtic words for oak, Druid or Druid, suggesting that the Druids were deeply connected to this tree as a symbol of spiritual power. The oak tree's roots were believed to reach into the underworld, while its branches stretched toward the heavens, symbolizing connection between the world of the living, the gods, and the ancestors. Sacred groves of oak trees were central to Druidic rituals, and it was within these groves that the Druids would perform their ceremonies, seeking guidance from the divine and the spirits of nature. The mistletoe, which grew on oak trees, held a particularly powerful place in Druidic spirituality. The Druids believed that mistletoe possessed healing powers and could act as a powerful talisman to ward off evil and bring about blessings of fertility, protection, and health. The harvesting of mistletoe was a highly sacred activity, often carried out during the winter solstice, which marked the rebirth of the sun. The Druids would cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, offering it in ritual ceremonies to ensure the prosperity of the land and its people. This act of harvesting mistletoe was considered a divine task, and the ritual was often accompanied by invocations to the gods and offerings to the spirits of the forest. In addition to trees, the Druids also had a deep connection to the rivers and lakes that flowed through the land. Water, like trees, was seen as a conduit between the human world and the divine. The Celts believed that rivers and lakes were inhabited by spirits, and that these bodies of water were sacred gateways to the other world, a realm of the gods, ancestors, and mystical beings. The Druids, as spiritual mediators, would perform rituals near sacred rivers or lakes, seeking guidance, blessings, or healing from the spirits associated with these water sources. In some cases, water was believed to have the ability to heal, and certain wells and springs became sites of pilgrimage for those seeking physical or spiritual restoration. The association between water and healing was not limited to the Celts. Many ancient cultures, from the Egyptians to the Romans, revered water as a sacred force, underscoring its universal spiritual significance. The moon also held great importance in Druidic thought. The Druids, like many ancient peoples, observed the cycles of the moon with great attention, using its phases to mark the passage of time and to guide their spiritual practices. The moon was often associated with the feminine divine, representing the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. The full moon, in particular, was a time of heightened spiritual power, when the veil between the worlds was thought to be thinnest, allowing for clearer communication with the gods, spirits, and ancestors. The Druids, with their profound understanding of the natural world, would have used the phases of the moon to time important rituals, ceremonies, and festivals, such as the celebration of Samhain, a festival that marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, when the spirits of the dead were believed to walk the earth. The sun, too, was a central figure in Druidic worship. The sun was regarded as a symbol of life, vitality, and illumination, and the Druids, like many ancient cultures, saw the cycle of the sun as a reflection of the cycles of life. The solstices, the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its lowest point, and the summer solstice, when it reaches its highest, were times of great spiritual significance. The Druids saw the winter solstice as a time of rebirth, when the sun was born again, signaling the return of light and the beginning of the cycle of growth and renewal. The summer solstice, on the other hand, was a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the abundance of the earth, when the sun's strength was at its peak. These solar festivals, such as Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, were intimately tied to the agricultural cycle, marking important points in the seasonal calendar that reflected the rhythms of life and death. In addition to the celestial bodies, the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, were fundamental to Druidic spiritual practices. The Druids believed that these elements were the building blocks of the universe, and that each element had its own unique spiritual properties. Earth was associated with stability, fertility, and growth, air with intellect, communication, and the breath of life, fire with transformation, passion, and renewal, and water with healing, intuition, and the flow of life. The Druids would call upon these elements during their rituals, using them to channel spiritual energy and to create harmony between the forces of nature and the human soul. Sacred fires, for example, were lit during certain festivals to symbolize the sun and its life-giving energy. The Druids, with their deep understanding of the elements, would use fire as a tool for purification, transformation, and spiritual awakening. One of the most important aspects of Druidic practice was the reverence for the land itself. The Druids believed that the land was not simply a physical resource to be used and exploited, but a living, breathing entity with its own spirit and consciousness. This reverence of the land was reflected in the Druidic belief that the health of the land was directly tied to the spiritual well-being of the community. In their rituals, the Druids would often perform acts of offering and sacrifice to honor the spirits of the land, ensuring that the earth remained fertile and that the people would receive its blessings in the form of abundant crops, healthy livestock, and prosperity. The concept of land as sacred was central to Druidic thought, and it is likely that the Druids saw themselves as guardians of the land, entrusted with maintaining its spiritual balance and harmony. The connection between Druidic practices and nature also extended to the animals that roamed the land. The Druids believed that animals were messengers of the gods, embodying specific spiritual qualities and lessons. Certain animals, such as the stag, the boar, the wolf, and the eagle, were considered sacred and were often associated with specific deities or spiritual attributes. The Druids believed that by observing the behavior of these animals, they could gain insight into the will of the gods or learn important lessons about courage, strength, wisdom, and freedom. The spiritual symbolism of animals played an important role in Druidic rituals, and many of the animals that were revered by the Druids continue to hold symbolic significance in modern pagan and spiritual traditions. The Druidic connection to nature was not limited to their religious rituals, but permeated all aspects of their lives. The Druids lived in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world, working with the land rather than against it. They understood the importance of balance, sustainability, and respect for the earth cycles. The Druids believed that by living in alignment with the natural world, they could achieve spiritual enlightenment, inner peace, and harmony with the divine. In this sense, the Druids were early environmentalists, recognizing that the health of the land and the well-being of the people were inextricably linked. In conclusion, the connection between Druidic practices and nature was not merely symbolic or superficial. It was foundational to their spiritual worldview. The Druids saw nature as a sacred reflection of the divine, and their rituals, practices, and beliefs were deeply intertwined with the land, the elements, and the creatures that inhabited it. For the Druids, the natural world was not just a place of beauty and wonder, but a living, breathing force that held the key to understanding the mysteries of existence and the divine. Their reverence for nature remains an enduring legacy, inspiring modern spiritual practices that seek to reconnect with the earth and live in harmony with the natural world. The ancient Druids, whose practices and beliefs were woven deeply into the fabric of Celtic society, left an indelible mark on the spiritual consciousness of humanity. While their prominence in the historical record waned with the rise of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity, the core ideas and spiritual wisdom of the Druids have persisted through the centuries. In recent years, there has been a notable resurgence in interest surrounding Druidry, with many modern spiritual movements seeking to reconnect with the ancient traditions and practices that the Druids upheld. From contemporary neo-Druidism to broader pagan and environmental movements, the influence of the Druids on modern spiritual practices is profound, blending ancient wisdom with contemporary values. The revival of Druidic practices in modern times is part of a larger movement of spiritual renewal, wherein people seek to rediscover ancient traditions that are rooted in the natural world, mythology, and the cycles of life. Many modern practitioners of Druidry view the ancient Druids not as relics of the past, but as spiritual ancestors whose wisdom is still relevant today. For them, Druidry is not a rigid religious system, but a fluid, evolving path that allows individuals to connect with nature, engage with the divine, and seek personal and collective transformation. This flexible and adaptable approach to Druidry has allowed it to thrive in an era that is increasingly disconnected from nature and spiritual traditions. At the heart of modern Druidry is a reverence for nature, a core value that the Druids themselves held sacred. Many contemporary Druidic practitioners regard the earth as a living entity, and they believe that human beings have a sacred responsibility to care for and protect the natural world. This reverence for nature is not simply a philosophical or aesthetic appreciation of the environment, but a deeply spiritual connection that infuses everyday life. Modern Druids often incorporate rituals and practices that honor the cycles of nature, such as celebrating the solstices and equinoxes, paying homage to sacred trees, and performing rituals at natural sites like groves, rivers, and mountains. These practices are seen as a way of aligning oneself with the rhythms of the earth, fostering a deep sense of interconnectedness with the world around them. One of the key influences that the Druids have had on modern spirituality is in the realm of seasonal rituals and celebrations. The ancient Druids celebrated a series of festivals that were deeply connected to the agricultural and natural cycles of the year. These festivals marked key points in the solar calendar, such as the winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox, as well as the midpoints between these events, including Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. These festivals were designed to honor the changing seasons, celebrate the harvest, and acknowledge the cyclical nature of life and death. Today, many modern pagan and neo-Druidic communities continue to observe these festivals, adapting them to fit contemporary life while maintaining their core spiritual significance. For example, Samhain, which marks the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, is celebrated as a time when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. This festival is often associated with honoring ancestors and loved ones who have passed, as well as reflecting on the cycles of life and death. Beltane, on the other hand, celebrates fertility, renewal, and the blossoming of life in the spring. It is a time of joy and celebration, often marked by dancing around a maypole and honoring the sacred union of the divine feminine and masculine energies. The celebration of these seasonal festivals has not only become a way for modern practitioners of Druidry to connect with the natural world, but has also been incorporated into broader spiritual movements, such as Wicca and contemporary paganism. The neo-Druidic tradition, as it is practiced today, draws heavily from these ancient festivals, adapting them to contemporary life and imbuing them with new meanings that reflect modern concerns, such as environmentalism, sustainability, and social justice. The Druidic focus on nature's cycles as a way of understanding spiritual growth, renewal, and transformation has had a lasting influence on how contemporary spiritual seekers engage with the natural world. Another area where Druidic influence has left its mark is in the spiritual practice of divination. The ancient Druids, as spiritual leaders and seers, were known for their ability to interpret signs and omens, to read the natural world, and to gain insight into the future. One of the most well-known forms of Druidic divination was the practice of Ogham, an ancient Celtic alphabet that is often used in modern Druidic readings. The Ogham script was carved into stones, often marking sacred sites or marking boundary points. Each letter of the Ogham alphabet corresponds to a tree, plant, or natural element, and these symbols were used as a form of divination or as a way of interpreting messages from the spiritual world. Today, the Ogham is still used by modern Druids and pagans as a tool for divination, meditation, and spiritual guidance. Practitioners of Ogham often use the symbols of trees, plants, and natural elements to gain insight into their personal lives, make decisions, or connect with the spirit world. This form of divination is deeply connected to the natural world and its cycles, as each tree or plant symbolizes particular qualities or energies that can be applied to a person's life. In addition to Ogham, modern Druidry has also influenced the practice of astrology, particularly in its connection to the cycles of the moon and the sun. The ancient Druids were keenly aware of the celestial bodies and their movements, and they observed the changing of the seasons in relation to positions of the sun and moon. Today, many Druidic practitioners continue to use astrology as a tool for understanding the cycles of the universe and the ways in which these cycles influence personal growth, relationships, and the unfolding of destiny. This connection between Druidic wisdom and astrology has contributed to the larger contemporary movement toward cosmic spirituality, where the movement of the stars, planets, and celestial bodies are seen as guiding forces in human life. Another significant area of Druidic influence is in the practice of meditation and spiritual contemplation. The Druids were known for their ability to enter states of deep meditation and trance, often in sacred natural settings, to commune with the gods, the spirits, and the ancestors. These practices were not simply a form of mental relaxation, but were believed to be ways of accessing higher levels of consciousness and spiritual wisdom. In modern Druidic practices, meditation remains a central element, with practitioners using guided visualizations, breathwork, and rituals to connect with the natural world and open themselves to divine inspiration. Many modern practitioners of Druidry also incorporate shamanic practices into their spiritual work. The Druidic tradition, with its emphasis on nature, ancestors, and the spirit world, shares many similarities with shamanic traditions from other cultures. The use of ritual tools such as staffs, stones, and ritual clothing, as well as the practice of journeying to the other world, mirrors the practices of shamans across the globe. In fact, many modern Druids see themselves as contemporary shamans, seeking to restore balance and harmony to their own lives and the world through their spiritual work. Finally, the environmentalist and eco-spiritual movements owe much to Druidic influences. Modern Druidry is often seen as a form of earth-based spirituality that emphasizes the importance of environmental stewardship and sustainability. The Druids' deep connection to nature, their understanding of the sacredness of the land, and their reverence for the elements have inspired a generation of eco-conscious individuals who seek to live in harmony with the earth. In the face of environmental degradation, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity, many contemporary spiritual communities, inspired by Druidic values, have become advocates for ecological sustainability, conservation, and the protection of sacred natural spaces. In conclusion, the influence of the Druids on modern spiritual practices is both profound and far-reaching. From a revival of ancient seasonal rituals to the integration of Druidic wisdom in divination, astrology, and meditation, the spiritual legacy of the Druids continues to resonate with people seeking a deeper connection to nature and the divine. The Druidic path, with its emphasis on harmony with the natural world, reverence for the elements, and pursuit of spiritual wisdom, remains a vital and transformative spiritual tradition that continues to inspire and guide seekers today.